think a lot of what we've discussed this morning really leads in very well to our session this afternoon. It kind of goes without saying that international trade is really the lifeblood of the Mexican, well, in many ways the Mexican economy, but certainly the Mexican automotive industry. And not just in terms of exporting so much, but a value chain, which, as our colleague from BMW highlighted and was discussed this morning, a value chain which is also very complex and international, with many parts from the US, but also many parts from Asia, from Europe and elsewhere. Some of that to our regret, perhaps, today, given the disruption from the coronavirus, but certainly even if there's more opportunities to localize and regionalize, the international trade aspect of the supply chain remains prominent. And therefore, managing trade rules, customs clearance, efficient border processes, security and safety in and out of facilities and for trade is really paramount. I think the competitive factor for Mexico in the future to remain competitive when it comes to gaining new vehicle programs, whether it's in competition with the US or with Europe or Asia, the trade side has to really work and function very well. And so that's why we've put together really, I think, a great multifaceted panel to kind of go through a lot of the issues with you and talk through some solutions on our topic of smooth customs and frictionless trade, best practice at the border. So we're going to have three fairly short presentations, and then we'll have a bit more time this round, I hope, for Q&A and interaction from you as well, because that's really an important part of this. So I'll introduce our panel first before I bring our first speaker on. Berenice Igur, very happy to have back, International Trade and Customs Partner for KPMG Mexico. And then we'll also hear from Guillermo Rosales, who's the Director General for AMDA. Very pleased to welcome as well Todd Skiles, Senior Vice President Sales, Supply Chain Solutions, and Dedicated Transport Solutions for Ryder Mexico. And joining us on the panel, without a presentation, but taking part in the Q&A and in the discussion, is Enrique de la Peña, Senior Manager for Mexican-US Operations from Hyundai Glovis, so playing a really key role, I would say, in the aspects with Kia and the production that is obviously in Mexico here, and obviously other operations as well. So a good mix of views there. So without further ado, if I can ask Berenice to come join us, we'll kick it off.
Muchas gracias. Es un gusto estar aquí.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Chris, for the invitation once again. And I want to thank all the team that makes this presentation possible. In the next 10 minutes or so, I will be talking to you about two elements. First of all, the trends in the automotive industry, and secondly, the risks, or better yet, the challenges in international trade. Now, talking about the trends in the automotive industry towards 2030, the results that I'm going to show you right now are results from a survey that is done by KPMG every year. We've been doing this survey for over 20 years to executives in the automotive industry. In this case, besides the executives that are directly related to the assembly plants of vehicles and auto parts, we are also considering companies that are providing services such as information technology, for instance, and financial services, and even interviews with some government representatives. This is to have a more overarching idea of the industry and where the trends are leading us. So just highlighting some of the aspects that I selected for this session. The first item is that 59% of the automotive respondents considered connectivity and digitalization as the number one trend up to 2030. Now, if we look at this in regional clusters, besides this trend, we can also highlight, for instance, the aspect of electric battery vehicles and electric vehicles with combustion cells. Another element to be considered are OEMs. It's important to look into tomorrow's industry, all the changes and alterations in the market. The conditions are being changed, and we could also expect a reduction in the global markets. Most executives consider the design, and here we're focusing mainly on technology, is not necessarily in the hands of OEMs anymore. And why is that? Because now regulators are including a very important aspect. 2 out of 3 execs that were interviewed considered that by 2030, less than 5% of the global car production will originate from Western Europe. So it's worth highlighting here that those who agreed in over 80% with this statement were India, China, and North America. Now, talking specifically about the North American region, these are the strategies that were highlighted in the survey. The first one, and the most relevant one, is the cooperation among different players in the industry. We consider that the industry should generate these new strategies for cooperation in the short and long term. For instance, we're expecting trends of modification, such as an increase in the number of tier 1 companies and a reduction in mass production companies. In the long term, we are expecting a diversification, but also a lot of specialization. For instance, we could find companies that would be specifically devoted to recycling and remanufacturing vehicles and auto parts. And this question is related to how each of the interviewees perceive the situation of the automotive industry from the political standpoint. And we can see very dissimilar answers. In Canada, 50% state that the industry has a very clear perspective, and 50% says that it's not so much. In the case of Mexico, most execs consider that the policies of the automotive industry is not clear at all. And on the contrary, in the US, over 90% of interviewees in the US is clear about where the industry is moving in their country. And this opens enough space for the challenges that I want to talk to you about in international trade. In the morning, we were already talking in the first 2 presentations about the new NAFTA or USMCA, COSMA, or TMEC, depending on the country where we are at. And definitely, this is going to be a challenge that we're going to face. There are certain relevant aspects that we should take into account before this treaty is effective. First of all, uniform regulations. If we don't know very well what are the rules of the game, it's going to be very hard to plan what we're going to do. Another element is that each of the countries should select a panelist that they are going to use in case of dispute settlement. The third aspect is that we're still waiting for the confirmation, the ratification of Canada. And once these 3 elements are fulfilled, we're going to have an exchange of diplomatic notes to confirm that the ratification processes have finished in all of the countries. Taking that into account, the treaty will become effective on the 3rd day of the 3rd month after the last notification. We were also talking about the rules of regional content, and more than just telling you about percentages, the idea here is for each of us to bring home the objective of analyzing how we have to adapt our supply chain to adapt all the requirements. If we're talking about light vehicles, we have 3 years. If we're talking about heavy-duty vehicles, we have up to 7 years. Now, the second element of the rules of regional content is regarding aluminum and steel. 70% has to be original from the area. In the modification protocol that was signed in December, they specified that in the case of steel, beginning the 7th year, it will be considered originally sourced when the process from the manufacturing to the finished part happens in the same region. Now we're including two charts. The first one is the information on the main components of light vehicles in 1994. The second chart shows us the main components for vehicles, and this is average information from 2017 to 2019. So in over 20 years, we can see that steel, iron, and aluminum had a reduction of 15%, more or less. And I think that the challenge for the industry here comes twofold. On the one hand, to comply with this requirement of regional content, but on the other hand, we could also explore research and development to continue decreasing the usage of those components as part of these materials as part of the vehicle. Now, the third element is definitely the content of labor. And this is relevant because three areas will be considered for this measurement. Research and development, where I don't see any issue happening in any of the countries, but it also considers the assembly and manufacture. In the case of Mexico, we can see that a fourth of jobs that were created before August 2019 in the manufacturing industry are related to the automotive industry. And out of this fourth, 87% was specifically for auto parts. So this is where I believe that the challenge to the industry lies. So what are we expecting? We're expecting a smooth transition from NAFTA to USMCA. And the treaty considers a transition period where it will be possible to use the rules of origin of NAFTA for a while to be able to have an access to the most favored rate in the most favored nation rate in the US, but we don't know for how long this benefit is going to be available. So we cannot consider that we're going to have it for the next 16 years where the USMCA is effective. Another important element is that all the documentation that is created under the NAFTA has to be kept for at least 5 years. Despite the fact that now we have the USMCA effective, or will have it effective. And the last challenge that we decided to include here is the element of compliance and the documents that are required for export and import procedures in each of the countries. This is information from doing business, and as you can see, definitely in the case of Mexico, we have a big challenge. It takes us very long to generate the documents that are needed to promote the operations of import and export trade, and even more so in customs. So we can use the mutual recognition agreements, we can incentivize and use customs that have joint clearance, and the treaty will also have a chapter besides source procedures, including customs procedures, to make it more and more efficient. So in the end, this is an invitation for us to take into account the trends, the challenges, and to be able to carry on a smooth transition from NAFTA to USMCA. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. I think that was a great 10 minutes that packed a lot in and actually highlighted in quite some impressive detail some of the actual challenges that will come in the implementation of USMCA, and obviously what that means in the supply chain, and indeed for Mexico. So some more detail I think that we can come back to on the Q&A. But actually now I'd like to invite our second speaker from the Association of Automotive Distributors, Guillermo, who will give us more perspective on some of the trade sides of the vehicle industry. So looking forward, Guillermo.
Thank you, Chris. Muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias.
Afternoon, and I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity of being here with us, with you, and to tell you about the conditions that continue to be in the domestic automotive market and the challenges that this represents for foreign trade and everything related to logistics and customs clearance. A first approach to this issue would lead us to analyze the structure that prevails in the domestic market, comparing the vehicles that are marketed in the country from the established plants, the assembly plants that are established in Mexico, and the complementary offer. And in that regard, we see that from 2005 to 2019, our market has suffered a very relevant transformation. We went in only 14 years from a structure where 2/3 would represent vehicles that were originally made in Mexico, with 30% of foreign vehicles, to a market last year where 66%, 2/3, we inverted the proportion, are vehicles coming from another region in the world, and only 34% of vehicles sold in Mexico come from a plant that is established in our territory. And this simple shift in the figures that I just told you entails a significant transformation in the planning of the distribution networks and logistics, and of course in the participation in the relationship that we have with customs procedures. We see that 2 out of 3 vehicles sold in Mexico have to be imported. And this isn't the only shift. Also, in these 14 to 15 years, we saw a transformation of the share of vehicles coming from out of the country to be sold in Mexico. In 2005, 36% of vehicles, foreign vehicles sold in our country, would come from the North American region, mostly from the US. And from Asia, we would only have 16% coming. Last year, 58% of vehicles imported come from Asia. And this isn't just a shift in preferences regarding the dynamics of the Mexican market, and that's it. There is a very significant difference in terms of logistics. It is not the same to import a vehicle from a plant that is established in Detroit or Nashville than bringing it from India or Japan or China itself. And this is confirmed where we look at the origin per country, not only region. In 2005, the United States was the main supplier of vehicles complementing the Mexican offer with 32%. And now, in 2019, we had India as the main country of origin for the Mexican supply, followed by Japan with 16%. And where are the vehicles introduced to Mexico? Well, this change in our main supplier being North America, the US, that would allow us to transport most vehicles uh, through um, railways and highways. Now that most vehicles come from Asia or other or regions other than North America, have has necessarily increased the participation of our maritime ports as the entry point to our market. 90% of the vehicle import happens through our maritime ports. And highlighting on the side of the Gulf of Mexico, the port of Veracruz, with a share of 54% in the area of the Gulf of Mexico and 38% through Lázaro Cárdenas, which is the second entry point in terms of vehicle introduction. And 10% is complemented with the railroads and highways through the north border. And this change in the dynamics of the supply for the domestic market in Mexico, when we look at it in hindsight, has been very radical and in a very short span of time. And I want to add a piece of information here which represents a higher challenge in logistics planning. The variables that the the demand has been having in Mexico. We went from 2005, which was a year with an internal market that would barely reach 1 million vehicles, to a record year in 2016 with a demand of 1.6 million units. A span of time of expansion from 2014 to 2016, which represented challenges in logistic terms to respond to this increase in such a short span of time in the domestic demand. Everything related to the conditions of maritime supply, but also with internal distribution, with the trucks that are called nodrizas, or mother cars in Mexico, using our highway network, insufficiency in our transportation network and our highway network. And when the market prepared to respond to this demand, suddenly in just 3 years, we lost almost 20% of our demand. Last year, we finished with 1.3 million units, which led us in 3 years to a yearly loss of 100,000 units, which also represents a loss of opportunity and a loss of prior investments. And in face of what these transformations represent, and together with what Berenice was telling us about adapting to the new USMCA agreement, what is it that we see as challenges or opportunities in what's related to customs procedures and logistics for supplying the automotive market in Mexico? Well, what we see is this cycle where in infrastructure, as was already mentioned, by having 90% of the vehicle import happening through maritime ports, the first question would be, do we have enough capacity in our Mexican ports? By measuring the meters of ports and patios for maneuvers in the area of the ports. And according to a logistics study that was done jointly, or was better yet sponsored by the Ministry of Economy in Mexico, AMIA, AMDA, and INA in 2017, the answer back then would be, we do have enough capacity regarding infrastructure in the ports of our country. Of course, thus taking into account the adjustments and maintenance of the port of Veracruz. However, in this same study, we can see that we have some significant deficiencies in, in the satellite or secondary structure to become more efficient in the administration of our ports. The case of Veracruz is an excellent example of what I'm just telling you, particularly regarding the import and export of vehicles. The area around the port of Veracruz is just simply put just chaos, with the entrance and exit of trucks loaded with vehicles that are waiting to be exported, or the other way around, the vehicles that are leaving the port for national distribution. What happens here is that we do not have enough space, enough room to store and to load on and off all the vehicles for the processes that are related to foreign trade, not necessarily regarding our port infrastructure, but that are necessary to optimize their operation. And the same case applies both for entry and exit of vehicles from Mexico when we face different restrictions in quality and capacity in our highway network. And also, and particularly talking about the northern border, a deficient infrastructure in railroads, particularly in the border crossings, international crossings. But it's not only the physical infrastructure that has a lot of opportunities to improve. This is also linked to the usage and the necessary investment in innovation and technology. And one of the main bottlenecks also in port operations is related to security. And security, meaning the prevention of contraband of drugs, weapons, and money, and the other way around, the exit of the same materials and items and forbidden items from our country to other countries. And this creates significant bottlenecks because we want to prevent and fight crime by subjecting all the merchandise to the same rules of inspection, including merchandise that is perfectly validated, such as vehicles. So we're missing a lot of investment in high technology equipment to be able to expedite the revisions and the security processes. But not only regarding prevention and fighting crime shows our technological inefficiency. When Bernice was talking about the adaptations to the USMCA, it is necessary for procedures in the exit and entry of vehicles to agree on uniform rules. We are not going to be on time ready for all the processes for automotive companies and the Mexican customs to be able to comply with this if we do not have a more expedite and accelerated work from the three governments in this issue. And in what would be considered simple in the operation of customs for imports, and now moving to the element of planning and training, we reach absurd situations where the customs officers that are clearing in Veracruz that are not understanding the same or demanding the same as an officer in Lázaro Cárdenas or Nuevo Laredo. In our national bureaucracy, there is no uniformization of criteria. There are no standard procedures, and they should be more clear and better understood by the operators, both public and private, in foreign trade. And we need procedures that are more standard and automated. And our main challenge, the main challenge that we are facing, not only in foreign trade, not only in automotive trade, but also the challenge that we have as Mexicans to guarantee our survival as a nation state, which is security. Without security, everything else that we mentioned and all the opportunities that we have to be able to move forward in what's left of the 21st century is at risk.
Y desafortunadamente,
And unfortunately, we do not have good news. Robberies at the highways, robberies at the railroads, blockades to maneuvers when in Lázaro Cárdenas the trucks leave the port, in Manzanillo through the railroads is still a bottleneck, and it's putting the operations at risk in our country, and we have to focus on addressing all these issues. We need a lot of investment, and none of the governments so far have been willing to invest to improve law enforcement and to improve law enforcement through the judicial system so that we can all accept the same rules, we can follow them, and if there's a person or a company that wants to break the law, it is highly probable that it will be punished by the justice system, that it works efficiently so that justice is made. If we don't have that, it'll be we will all be at risk, and we will not be able to take advantage of all the opportunities offered by the supply chains, chains of value, etc. And this is not only opening to the automotive industry, but the Mexican economy as a whole, with also the partnership with China. Thank you for the invitation from the organizers. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Guillermo. Again, another really fascinating insight there. I think giving us that overview of just in a way how the Mexican market, domestic market, has changed so dramatically in the last 15, 20 years, gives us a lot of insight into the complexity around trade. And then you obviously went into tremendous detail, which I'm sure resonates with everyone here in terms of the challenges and lack of standards, security issues, and et cetera, which again, we'll circle back more in the Q&A, and which I think are big issues for everybody in this room. Thank you for your passion as well. I think that resonates very clearly. I'd now like to invite Todd Skiles from Ryder Mexico. It will be our last presentation before we open to Q&A. Thank you, Todd. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Todd Skiles. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sales for Ryder Logistics and Dedicated Transportation here in Mexico and the U.S. And just so we know, I am not going to try to sell anybody anything. I'm not going to speak for 10 minutes to try to reposition Ryder. But I did want to speak for just a little bit on something that I'd like you to consider over the next 10 minutes. And that's a little bit about disruptors in the supply chain and how we can use those disruptors as a competitive advantage. So when we think about disruptors, folks, there's nothing new under the sun about disruptors in supply chain. Matter of fact, if you listen closely to a number of the presenters over the course of the day, a number of times people brought up reacting to or having the supply chain react to certain events that take place and having alternatives, having backups for when these events occur. But the idea of disruptors, since they're not new, I mean, if you think about the last 100 years, we've had wars, we've had changes in government, we have geopolitical issues, we have certainly had health crises like the coronavirus, and we have also had weather. But one thing that I think is somewhat unique to our time and age is the speed and the velocity at which these changes come and how quickly they expand out to the marketplace and start to affect our customers. Now, the stock market in the U.S. lost over 2,000 points in 2 days over the coronavirus. I Googled that yesterday just to get an idea, guys, of how many people have actually died of the coronavirus. Around 2,600 have actually died. In the US alone yesterday, there were over 3,600 deaths from different accidents that occurred. The reality of it is, folks, that the coronavirus has hit the marketplace as a disruptor so hard is because the information relative to it and the chance that it could grow into something huge hit the market quickly and with a lot of velocity, and it changed the supply chain. Well, at Ryder, we've been we've been in this business for quite a long time, and there's a number of our competitors that share this. And we started challenging ourselves, and I'll come back out to you guys and ask you what you think here in a moment. But we challenged ourselves is, since these disruptors are nothing new, and we talk predominantly about reacting to, what am I going to do if this occurs? Is it possible, from a supply chain perspective, to take the inevitability of disruptors and turn it into an advantage for your company? Can you turn the inevitability of disruption into a competitive advantage? How many folks think you can? Hey, my own sales guys could raise their hand, help me out a little bit on this. That's, in reality, guys, what this comes down to from our perspective is if we can work with our partners and we can start to predict what's going to happen and how we react to it, not once it happens, but before it happens, it changes the whole nature of the relationship with our customers. So there's three areas that I was thinking about. If somebody said, well, how do you go about, Todd, having been part of this conversation now for a little while, where do you guys focus? If I was going to even consider turning disruptors into a competitive advantage, where do you look? And the things that we thought about real quickly, guys, was innovation and technology. And there were three areas, and once again, I only had 10 minutes to go through this, but I thought about, in terms of innovation and technology, I thought about visibility. In terms of Mexico, I thought about safety. And I thought about the use of control towers, which a lot of third-party logistics companies use in order to help our customers make determinations on different modes of transportation, different changes we can make. So I'll start off with the control tower. The control tower is nothing new. It's been around for quite a while. And the idea when we use control tower is to work with our customers, understand their business, and make dynamic decisions relative to route and mode. If we can do that and we can work with our customers who use different types of transportation, and as the day progresses, we can help them decide what type of transportation. It could be a private fleet, it could be carriers, it could be some type of dedicated transportation, it could be intermodal, it could be train, but dynamically, if we could work with them, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could help them balance out cost and customer service on a as-is basis? In other words, as it's occurring. And the answer is yes. And over the years, we've been able to collect a lot of data, not just individual to our customers, but data relative to a lot of customers moving literally billions and billions of dollars worth of freight around the network. But the challenge there is, can I take that data and instead of using it to fix what has happened, can I look and predict what will happen? And quite honestly, guys, that's where this challenge becomes really, really difficult, because what we're talking about is not looking backwards in terms of, what do I need to react to today, but what circumstances and events do we see occurring where we need to think about how should you act 6 weeks from now, 6 months from now, taking into account that we know certain circumstances typically will occur over that time period. And it comes down to predictive analytics. The second thing we thought about was security. And security, it was kind of interesting. There was a commercial, and it kind of reminded me a little bit about security at Ryder. If you go back 10 or 11 years ago, we were very good at reacting when some security breach took place. We worked very, very hard and quite frankly have set our business up around products in Mexico that have value that need security. But it tended to be at its best once the event occurred. We had good collaboration with local and state authorities. We had good collaboration with our customers as to what we would do, but it still was predominantly focused on what we will do once something occurs. So once again, over the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years, we've collected enough data and knowledge where we can work with our partners and start to see certain events that when they occur within the environment that we're moving our freight, that should be a red signal that we may have a security issue. It hasn't happened, but it could happen. So you might say, well, what might be an example of that? It could be changes in security. It could be changes in personnel within our own locations that give us rise to believe that, hey, we've seen an influx of new folks coming in. Is there something happening behind the scenes here? It could be activity that we hear just by hearsay from our own employees. The reality of it is, folks, that if we can start to not only use the technology to address what is occurring, but work with our customers to help them understand when we see certain events occurring, that we can make changes proactively so that the event that we're concerned about possibly doesn't happen. And the last one is just that whole idea of the visibility. When we built, you can't really talk about supply chain and logistics without talking about visibility. And now we've all developed technology and software that I think provides fairly good visibility, at least from a transportation standpoint. But historically, once again, we use that visibility. We could tell you what is occurring. We had good visibility. If you wanted to see where your load is, we could show you where it is. The challenge now, folks, if you're going to turn those disruptors, which, as I said, we all know are occurring, if we're going to turn that into a competitive advantage, we need to start using that same technology all the way back into the warehouse so we can start to see what type of circumstances or events are occurring that we need to think about making a change prior to the actual event occurring. So, in conclusion, I'm still 1 minute and 27 seconds. In conclusion, guys, we all recognize that there's going to be changes within the environment in which we're doing business, and acting and reacting upon that is very important, and we'll always be focused on that. But the true goal, I think, moving forward is to take this data, create predictive analytics around it so we can start to understand what's coming in the future and how should we act together. And maybe in some cases, we can avert these situations from occurring in the first place and make a better situation for the customers. Thank you.
But 45 seconds to go, we even finish it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Todd. I think that was a very inspiring outlook there on what we need to do to embrace disruption, if you like, and turn it into an advantage. Obviously, the shift from reaction to predictive and how how in the supply chain what that means. It's we had an interesting discussion earlier in our ideas lab about world-class logistics, which moved in some of these directions, and a key bit that underlined that as well was partnership. Actually, I think was one of the main conclusions we drew back on. So that technology combined with partnership in the supply chain could really move things forward. Thanks to all of our panelists so far. We're going to move on to some Q&A. Before I open it up to the audience, I thought I might just look to bring Enrique into discussion. Enrique, obviously, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, is responsible for U.S.-Mexico operations for Hyundai Glovis, and in particular here for Kia in Monterrey. Enrique, can you give us a brief outline, if you like, of the your international trade network that you're working with and where your kind of key pain points are right now, which we might then address with the audience?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Our network right now, we ship to the US and Canada by rail from our plant directly. And we have stock transfer and to the dealers. And we have stock transfer by ocean going from our plant based in Pesquería, Nuevo León, and we move to Altamira port, and then we take the ship to Brunswick and Philadelphia. And then we deliver to the dealers from those ports in the east side and in the west side. We use rail directly. For the points that we are facing, or some talking about customs that we are talking in this issue, because when we start the operation, we develop a system together with logistics, because that's helped us to don't have some interruptions during transportation in the border with the railroads and vessels, because that's helped us to move smoothly and faster our shipments and don't have delays in the border or ports. Yes, that's one part of the piece, because I'm starting the shipping from the plant to the U.S.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you for that. Maybe just picking up on that, what Todd was talking about with control towers and moving some of the technology back to the supply chain. In terms of your supply chain, where do you feel, what key pieces of technology have helped you move forward? Or is it the technology piece which needs improvement from your side? Or is it less about technology for you right now? I thought maybe you could sort of reflect on that.
Well, yes, actually we have systems that help us to control all our operations on a daily basis, because we have like every ramp, every operations in Mexico, most of them are no manual operation going to the systems. That's helped us to have the control in our jars for finished vehicles. For talking about auto parts, there's another system that helps us to provide auto parts on time to the assembly line. Because we got there, and that's how we're doing right now.
Okay, great. Questions are open at any point now. We have a couple of mics moving around the room, so if you have a question for our panel, please just put up your hand, say your name and company, and we have, is that one there? Or we definitely have a hand here. Our microphone is too busy schmoozing with somebody else, so. I think we need the mic on. Is the mic on? Should be on now.
Okay. Roberto Zavala, Bolenos Wilhelmsen. Question for Berenice. I'll take it in Spanish. De toda la actualización de ahora el TMEC, alguna de las nuevas reglas, los cambios, puede ser reglas de origen, la parte laboral, ¿alguna de ellas consideras de especial riesgo en que las automotrices no vayan a poder ajustarse o cumplir, o consideras que con el tiempo que se está dando con el tiempo que se está dando para ajustarse y que los gaps no sean tan grandes, podemos asumir, o más o menos, yo sé que no tenemos una bola de cristal, pero se puede asumir que se va a cumplir, o ves alguna en específico que de acuerdo a sus análisis vean que se pudiera complicar más?
Claro, definitivamente toda la nueva regla es un reto.
The new chapters are a challenge. The industry has met these challenges since the NAFTA started. We have all adapted to the supply chain. Even though we have a specific time windows, I think we will be able to meet these time windows. However, the most relevant challenge is steel and aluminum. I insist in consistent rules and regulations, because we don't know how steel and value of regional content will be measured. They can be measured by plant, they can be measured by model and year, they can be measured by production line, RMC, whatever, but the result may be different according to the way this is measured. These are challenges, but if we don't have clear rules, it will be very complex to see which will be more difficult to meet. Thank you for your question.
Any other comments, questions from the audience? Right on this side. I think you have a microphone just behind you.
Thank you. My name is Bertrand Weiss from Boxmark. For Pamela, pardon.
Berenice.
Bernice, pardon.
Bernice.
In the presentation, you mentioned that the integration of the salary should be around $14, right? As a base. So for me, as being part of supply chain, would be interesting to understand if to whom this might apply. If it is only for the assembly plant, or does it go down until to the suppliers chain?
Yeah, the top is $16 per hour.
Okay.
And it is also part of the regulations. So we don't have that information. I assume that probably this will go to the tier 1 and tier 2 companies.
So it will be scaled down.
Yes.
And the reference right now, the $16, I understood that this is referred to the base salary also in the US, that it might also increase in the future. Is this right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you.
And just following on that, is that, maybe you addressed it, but can R&D costs get added into that somehow? So if you have your cost of your engineers and data scientists, etc., working and developing a vehicle, can that be calculated into that total somehow?
Yes, exactly. Actually, the labor content value includes research and development, assembly, and the manufacturing of the parts.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 3 components are
Yeah.
included. Yes.
Well, I mean, it's potentially doable, but it probably adds at the very least documentation complexity, I guess, around how you prove this per part or per vehicle.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And we are expecting that information as part of the regulations.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. I'd always been familiar with a general statistic that estimated that, I'm not sure if this is automotive, but if it's in general in Mexican manufacturing, the value chain input, if you like, from the US and Canada could be already as high as 40%. But this is not so easy to measure, I imagine, because you need to trigger down the tiers. Do you have any data, this is for you again, Vanessa, or anybody who have any data on the current value that what comes from the rest of North America into the Mexican value chain?
No, I don't.
No, that's.
No, sorry.
I can't believe you didn't bring that information. No. No, it's complicated, but I think if you look at this also from oil and what gets refined and lots of different processes, there is a lot of value that comes back from the US into the Mexican supply chain, and that's something that hopefully gets properly accounted into all this, but it certainly adds some complexity. Sorry, was there a question here? Okay. No. On the sort of, one of the messages we had from the Undersecretary this morning was sort of one of admitting that there will be more of trade friction on an international level, certainly outside of North America. Perhaps some debate about whether internally we'll still have some friction. This is for anyone on the panel. Do you share his optimism that this is actually a good thing for the region and for Mexico in terms of some of those extra layers of protection, if you like, on the external North American border? Versus what can be invested here. I have kind of, Guillermo, when I see your slides that show that India exports 20% of the vehicles here, I'm thinking, boy, putting up an extra barrier there doesn't sound like a good thing. But I just wondered if anyone had wanted to reflect on that sentiment.
Sobre India.
Como comenté en mi intervención,
In my presentation, the Mexican market has been changing over the years, has been changing their supply sources because we want to have the lowest costs for the Mexican demand. We have to keep in mind that the production platform established in Mexico is basically oriented to supply the North American market, US and Canada, and based on that, these are platforms of more added value, and most of them are far from the purchasing power for the consumer in Mexico. The average value of a vehicle is 320,000 pesos. That is approximately 15,000, 16,000 US dollars. And based on that, we need to add the supply for that type of consumer Mexicans, basically, and looking for lower price vehicles for similar markets in terms of purchasing power, such as India, China, Brazil, Argentina, in South America. And also we have increased the number of plants from the Eastern Europe, like Poland, to be able to supply a vehicle based on the purchasing power of the Mexican market. Y ciertamente
To allocate as much of that capacity to export to high-value markets, therefore using your capacity in a lower-value market like India is beneficial in that way. So, Todd, I wonder, can you talk a little bit about the technology that you're using in Mexico right now? I mean, you talked about moving it back through the supply chain, like back through to warehouses and to link up to create, to move towards this predictive analytics or predictive way of working. Have you seen leaps forward in terms of your operations here in Mexico? Are there barriers to next? What's the next step for people in the room to kind of take, if you like, concretely?
Well, there are certainly barriers, but the barriers, I think, are not unique to Mexico. I mean, certainly when you start to talk about the next range of technology relative to visibility per se, and you start to think about how do we deploy that out into the field, and how do we get the level or the level of data that we're looking for that would allow us to take it from reactive to, as you said, to predictive analytics. I mean, a lot of it really bears around the carriers themselves and their ability to work with you and provide the data back. I mean, I think a lot of the carriers have worked with us. They realize that the people in this room need that level of visibility. And I think someone mentioned, as often as once every 15 minutes. But as you start to take that to the next level and start to require more and more from your carriers and more technology, that it definitely becomes somewhat of a burden. Some of the carriers are much more quicker to adapt than others, and certainly that's not unique to Mexico. That's the same challenges we have in the U.S. and Canada. Same thing when you start to think about technology within the warehouse. What our customers are saying is that we want this technology, but we don't want to invest in it until we're sure it's going to provide the return on investment that we're looking for. So they're looking for vendors like Ryder to invest in warehouse technology in order to help them understand where they might deploy it and where it makes sense. And once again, the challenge is, which technology do you deploy? How much do you invest in that as a 3PL? Because once again, your customers are saying, you invest on our behalf, and then once we start to get a better flavor for where we can get that return on investment, we may consider making those investments along with you. So it's things that we have to do. We have to work on compliance. We have to work on deploying technology and helping our customers understand what works, what doesn't, what could work, and making those investments on their behalf so that we can be out in front of, whether it's warehouse technology, electric vehicles. We've got to be cutting edge on that and help our customers understand where it's going and how quickly it'll get there.
Absolutely. Again, in our ideas lab earlier, when this came up, one of the major issues that was several suppliers and OEMs in the group were talking about was that this transparency sometimes is blocked internally from companies as well. Sure. So companies struggle, whether the tier supplier and OEM, to get clarity of inventory or of parts between themselves, between plants. Therefore, then moving to the next stage to the carriers becomes even, it becomes yet another barrier. So certainly this theme of transparency and partnership, as I mentioned earlier, seems to really underline this journey as well. Any comments, questions from the floor? In terms of if we turn back a little bit to the title of the session around the smooth trade and on the customs side. In terms of the customs clearance process, in terms of dealing with customs, I mean, it's a perennial theme around capacity issues, around opening times for the customs authorities, around paperwork. Are we seeing any progress towards more digitalization of the customs process? Does the USMCA point to any hope in this area in terms of expediting this side, or as Bernice indicated, having to keep 5 years of paperwork or something on NAFTA. It sounded like the paperwork the paperwork was growing rather than shrinking. But maybe, Bernice, you want to talk a little bit to that in terms of those processes?
Well, at least in Mexico, we've been in a process of digitalization. It is a very tough question, and I think that maybe it would be better to have like an operative perspective. I don't know if you can.
Yeah.
Move past the question. Yes.
Okay. Well, talking about that I read from the TEMEC or USMCA, whatever, I see there is going to be a group to, for example, during the last year, we have some experience in the border. Just as Berenice mentioned it, there's no regulation or something that the authorities are following. Because when we had that issue, just they have to knock in the door in the head office in Mexico City because they don't know how to resolve. That we had some issue or some, and they catalogate like we did something very bad. And we say, no, we didn't. We just trying to fix. We knocked in the door to the Mexican authorities, and they say, no, you did something wrong. Just we have to go into the high levels in Mexican customs. But in the opposite side, the U.S. customs was very easy. Because we told them, that's crossed the border by mistake. And they say, no. Okay. In Mexico, they say, no, you did something wrong. And in the U.S., okay, those vehicles are not selling in Mexico. Just return it back. We can receive it. This is a big difference. Maybe it's the market, culture. There's a lot of opportunities in customs, as mentioned it. And I think that group or people between the three countries is going to help us to reduce those, because that at the end of the day, we spend time, money, and we have to pay penalties. Our customer has to pay penalty. Because that's going to delay the shipments. The customer that is going to receive the product, it was affected. Because with that group, it's going to help us, the three countries, to resolve controversies.
Todd, I don't know if you can speak to this at all as well, in terms from a rider, obviously deal a lot with the border, do many cross-border transactions every day. Do you want to talk a little about how processes are and where you'd like to see them improve?
Well, our perspective is a little different, I guess, because we pride ourselves on being experts at cross-border, and if it gets too easy and too simple, it isn't necessarily good for my business. A little bit of pain and discomfort goes a long way in the third-party logistics field. However, that being said, we certainly see the intent when you look over the documents and you look over, some of the changes. You can certainly pull out of that. The intent is to more streamline the process and make it more fluid, and certainly how that will come around and how that will actually happen. What we hope is, even with those intentions, understanding the nuances, as the gentleman mentioned, understanding the nuances and the differences in culture and how things are handled, and being able to facilitate for our customers to work through, inevitably, when the mistakes occur, we know how to handle this, so we can assist you in handling it to lower that impact to our customers, to lower the impact to their customers, is kind of where we see it. So, we certainly applaud any improvements in, how fluid we can do the work on the cross-border, but we also feel that inherently there will be complexities that partnerships help through.
Yeah. 3PLs, we heart your pain. I have a feeling that there'll be enough pain to go around.
There's typically enough pain.
Yeah. I'm sort of that.
There's always something new coming right around the corner.
You can take my glass half empty and turn it into something very positive in that kind of way from a 3PL point of view. Obviously, if anybody else has any comments from the audience about, I think there is there a question there? Yes, we'll go right there.
Yes, excuse me, Greg Borisay with the Port of San Diego. And since we're talking about border crossings and disruptors, one of the topics that's been coming up more and more frequently within our maritime and our real estate group is the possibility of a port-established FTZ at the new Otay crossing. There are a couple other ports over on the Texas side that are looking at this too, I believe, and I just was hoping that the group could comment on the efficacy of that kind of effort and whether it seemed to be timely. So essentially it would be a free trade zone on the US side to facilitate crossings and to help with the entries in and out across border. So hoping for some comments.
Does anybody have any insight on that, or perhaps any comments on that proposal?
I don't from our perspective.
No, sorry, I don't.
So obviously, using the power of the group, I'm not sure, does anybody have any insight to offer our friends from San Diego? I'm sorry, you came to the wrong place on this one occasion. But, your pain is also our heart, so we'll make sure that at Automotive Logistics we look into this, because it sounds like a very interesting proposal and one with kind of interesting impacts on the supply chain. So I'm certainly making a note of that, and we'll certainly come back and follow that up. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Run right in the front. The mic to you, fast as it can. Put our team to work.
Thank you very much. Luis Garcia from DSV. I have a question. We have discussed about digitalization, the TMEC, and that the bases are already set. However, it was mentioned today in the morning that the TMEC can be still renegotiated.
Yeah.
My question is, here in Mexico we have the BUSEM. I don't know if everybody is familiar with that topic. Currently, the BUSEM is quite of a lengthy process. How do you foresee in the short term that these renegotiations or any change of national context may affect the process at the BUSEM? You know that most OEMs still wants handled with steel, and the steel registration process at the BUSEM is quite of the more lengthiest ones and problematics for the customs process. Are you negative, positive that the process will be affected dramatically?
Well, from my perspective, I think that at least considering what it is currently in the USMCA, the BUSEM and all this type of digital windows among the region will be mandatory. So we are expecting the process in Mexico to be better.
Thank you.
Maybe time for one more question from the audience, if there is one, right there in the middle. Sorry, can somebody head off to, you see in the middle there, Daniel? Yeah, thank you.
Muchas gracias. Berenice, una pregunta. Desde tu punto de vista, el tema de endurecimiento de la regla de origen para el sector
of the
automotriz,
rules
sobre
of
todo para
origin for the
México,
automotive
tomando en
sector,
cuenta que
particularly
mucha
for
de la
Mexico,
proveeduría viene
taking
de
into
Asia, viene de
account that a
Europa.
lot of the supply comes
Desde tu
from
punto de vista,
Asia and
¿qué
from Europe.
ventajas o
From your
desventajas tiene la
standpoint,
industria
what are the
automotriz
advantages
en
or
el tema
disadvantages of
del
the automotive
endurecimiento de la
industry
regla
in
de
the
origen?
tightening of the rules of origin?
Pues ventajas sería
Well, the advantages,
justamente esta integración
well,
en la
that
cadena
would
de
be precisely
suministros, la
this
integración
integration
que
in the
va
supply
a
chain,
continuar
the
haciéndose
integration
todavía
that
más
will
fuerte,
continue
tanto la OEM como
becoming
sus
stronger
tiers,
and
¿no?
stronger
Y
in all the
desventajas,
tiers,
pues es que al
the
final
OEM
es
and
un
all the
cambio
tiers.
forzado.
And disadvantages
Entonces
is
ya
that
sabemos que
one
tenemos un
disadvantage is
periodo de
that it's
transición
forced. This
y
is a
en
change that is
cuanto
forced.
se haga
We
la
know that we
entrega
have a
de estas notas
transition,
diplomáticas, pues vamos a tener
and
2
once
meses para
the
ponerlas
diplomatic notes are delivered, we're going to have 3 months
in place, pero bueno,
to
eso
put them in
para
place,
implementarlas,
to
¿no?
implement them.
Entonces, ese es el gran reto.
So I think
Por
that's a
eso
big
su
challenge.
participación, y esta es una
That's why
invitación, creo que es el
your
foro
participation,
perfecto,
and this is an invitation because I
pero
believe this is the
el
perfect forum to
acercarnos
do
con la
so,
autoridad, el
to
acercarnos con
approach
Secretaría de
the
Economía,
authority, to
la
approach
carta
the
que
Ministry of Economy,
recibieron ayer y
and
a la
the
que
letter
se
that you received
refería,
yesterday that was
se
mentioned
referían en la mañana, es
by one of the
justamente
speakers in the morning is precisely
esta necesidad de la
this,
industria
or
por tener
reflects
mayor claridad.
this need of the
Yo
industry
les decía,
for
tenemos
more
las reglas, las
clarity.
conocemos,
We know the
todos
rules,
hemos estado
we have
escuchando sobre los
them,
cambios
but
para la
and we
industria
have all been
automotriz
hearing about the
desde el año
changes for the
pasado,
automotive industry since
pero
last year,
pues no podemos
but
tener ese
we
detalle suficiente para
cannot
empezar
have
a planear.
that
Y el punto
detail
es
that is
que la
enough to
forma
start
en la
planning.
que se mida,
And
insisto, los
the
resultados pueden
challenge
ser
here is
distintos si lo
that depending
vemos
on the way we
por
measure this,
RFC,
the
si lo
results
vemos
could be different if we measure by
Muchas gracias.
RFC or plant.
Okay, for that. Obviously, please use this invitation. This is, as Benny says, it's a perfect opportunity to work and share together and get more information. We'll help facilitate that as well. That's part of our job at Automotive Logistics. Maybe one last question from my side, because Guillermo raised obviously a passionate point about damage and the security issues as such and improving it. And I thought maybe, Enrique, maybe you could respond a little on that side in terms of your perspective of where things have improved, perhaps, or what things that Hyundai have done that maybe have avoided. You're somewhat blessed in your location, I think, perhaps, compared to some OEMs. But do you have some perspective for Guillermo and for others on how we might improve the situation?
Yep. Well, the location, it's important about security for our shipments. Yeah. Going to the U.S., most of our plants in Mexico, shipping most of the production to the U.S. In the Bajío area that I'm seeing, it's a lot of reduction is that I heard from other coworkers. Right now, it's the only area that I heard is in the Puebla, close to the Veracruz. In our side, that I can propose is we have to do our work. We have to do adjudication. If we're going to prosecute as a customer, owners of the product, we have to do it. And we have another meetings and committees that we are working to facilitate that, as I already mentioned. Yeah. Just something that we can do it is just pushing, continue, and having a session like this to work better and have a better security, first in the industry and everyone doing their job. Just that's going to help us. Just starting in our plan and then following the routes that we handle.
Sounds like a good start. I think we'll probably leave it there so that we have some more time for networking and coffee now before we move into our last session. Before I tell you a little bit about what's coming up, I want to thank our panel again for really some great input and great discussion. Muchas gracias.